Afghanistan. We're speaking to him in Bergen, Norway, and we're going to come back to our discussion, including his feelings about a surge of U.S. troops in Afghanistan. Ambassador Peter Galbraith with us. Stay with us.
Gracias a la vida que me ha dado tanto, me dio dos luceros que cuando las abro perfecto distingo lo negro del blanco y en el alto cielo su fondo estrellado y en las multitudes el hombre que yo amo. Gracias a la vida que me ha dado tanto, me ha dado el sonido, el abecedario, con las palabras que pienso y declaro, madre, amigo, hermano, y luz alumbrando la ruta del alma del que estoy amando. Gracias a la vida que me ha dado tanto, me ha dado la marcha de mis pies cansados.
The great singer Mercedes Sosa, she died this weekend singing Gracias a la Vida, thank you to life. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Anjali Kamet, and we're talking to Ambassador Peter Galbraith in Bergen, Norway. He was the top U.S. diplomat at the UN in Afghanistan, number 2 in the mission there, just fired by the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. Anjali?
Ambassador Galbraith, in your piece for the Washington Post this Sunday, you write that your former boss, Kai Eide, ordered you not to pursue the issue of fraud. Can you explain exactly how he did this?
Well, Anjali, I covered that. I'd be happy to go over it again. First, in advance of the election, when I was trying to reduce the number of the ghost polling stations, he ordered me to stop doing that after the Afghan ministers complained about it, although, of course, they were working for President Karzai, who would turn out to be the beneficiary of the fraud. At another stage in the process, we had collected very substantial data on fraud and turnout. This was done by the UN staff at considerable personal risk. Afghanistan is a dangerous place to operate. And then we wanted to do what our mandate is, which is to support the Afghan institutions, turn this evidence over to the Election Complaints Commission. He ordered the mission not to turn over the evidence, to sit on it. And then when the Independent Election Commission, which was really a pro-Karzai body, decided to abandon its safeguards, he objected when I intervened with them to try to get them to keep the safeguards. His argument is that that the UN Security Council resolution says that the United Nations should support Afghan institutions in a Afghan-run election, and therefore we shouldn't intervene. But in fact, of course, the mandate is to support not just elections, but free, fair, and transparent elections, not a fraudulent one. And it's, in my view, absurd to say that the international community doesn't have an interest in how these elections are conducted. First, taxpayers from the wealthy countries, and particularly the United States, paid for these elections. They cost over $300 million. So there's an obvious interest. But second, and even more important, these elections were a critical part of the political process in Afghanistan. The hope was that they would bring greater stability. They have now brought much greater instability. They've been the biggest strategic triumph for the Taliban since 2001, And with 100,000 troops there, of course, the United States and its NATO allies had a huge interest in that these elections be done properly, and frankly, the United Nations mission failed to do its job.
Ambassador Galbraith, I want to ask you about the audit that's going to begin shortly. I want to turn to an excerpt of an interview on Al Jazeera with Grant Kippen. He's the head of the UN-backed Electoral Complaints Commission, and he's explaining why the audit will only look at 10% of the suspect polling boxes.
We have two processes in place at the moment. One is the investigations with respect to the complaints that we've received to date, and there are some 2,300 complaints that we've received since polling day. The other is the process I just mentioned, the audit and the recount process. And we've, this audit and recount will look at those polling stations there where we believe more information needs to be gathered in terms of the manner in which the process was conducted. So at this point in time, we will continue to work through these two different processes and make decisions based on the information we collect. So in terms of the other 90%, at this point, we've not received complaints that affect the other 90%, maybe a little bit less, but by and large, the complaints that we deal with come from different candidates and individuals, and we'll be focusing on that.
Ambassador Galbraith, your response, and can you explain if these 10% of suspect ballot boxes, if they include the 1,500 polling stations that you mentioned, the ghost polling stations?
They include many of the ghost polling stations. The Independent Election Commission published guidelines, the ones that I tried to keep in place that they chose to abandon because they, in fact, would have harmed Karzai. Those guidelines said that they would quarantine for further examination polling places in certain categories. For example, if it had more than 600 votes. Why? Because 600 ballots was all any polling station got. If it reported more than 90% of the vote for a single candidate. If the polling station was closed, these results would all be excluded. The IEC included those results, and now that created about 3,500 polling stations in that category. What the Election Complaints Commission is doing a sample of those 3,500, looking at them. I think it'll be about 350 of these polling stations. They'll do an audit. That means they'll open the ballot box, look, for example, to see if the ballots were all marked the same way, look to see if there were any ballots in the ballot box to begin with, were the ballot papers folded, because if they weren't folded, that means they weren't put into the ballot box by a voter, because you could only get them in through the slot by voting. Anyhow, there are a number of audit techniques that they have. If, as it turns out, that random sample shows that almost all of it's fraudulent, they will then exclude the full 3,000, and then we'll see whether that leads to a runoff. I have confidence in this process, which incidentally was only started after the disagreement between the head of the mission and myself became public. But there's a problem with it, which is not in any way the fault of the Election Complaints Commission. And the problem is that the fraud was committed on a massive scale. Up to a third of the votes for President Karzai were not actually cast by voters. This process will catch some of the fraud, hopefully a lot of the fraud, but a lot of the fraud will remain undetected. And so that's what is going to make it so hard for Afghans, and particularly those who support the opposition, to have confidence in the final outcome.
Ambassador Peter Galbraith, have you been pressured by the United Nations not to speak to the press? And then I want to ask you about the latest attack over the weekend. 8 U.S. troops, 2 Afghan police officers died. Do you support a military surge in Afghanistan?
Well, to answer your first question, I want to emphasize that this disagreement between myself and the head of mission, it was longstanding, it was serious, and it was private. I did not choose to speak out. I did not speak out as